Hi, my name is Beth Massey, and today I'm going to show you how we can build a simple N-tier application using a new feature of the Dataset Designer called N-tier datasets. This enables a simple yet very common scenario when designing distributed applications. It's good practice to separate your data access code from your user interface code for many reasons, like maintenance and readability, or for better security and scalability. When you separate your data access code, you can easily move to a more scalable N-tier architecture if necessary, where your data access components reside in a middle-tier server or server farm, and your Windows clients are scattered across the company or internet, for instance. This is what we call N-tier applications. Currently, what's hard in Visual Studio 2005 with respect to using datasets in an N-tier architecture is that table adapter code, the code that connects to the database and performs the select, insert, update, delete functions, is physically tied to the dataset structure and validation code you can write in the partial dataset class. In many N-tier scenarios, we need to use the dataset structure and validation logic on our client side or a presentation tier, but we do not want to have the data access code there. So in order to use datasets in an N-tier scenario with Visual Studio 2005, you lose out on using the designers and have to do your data access manually, or you have to keep separating the generated code by hand. And we all know that's not a good idea. So in Visual Studio 2008, this particular N-tier scenario is enabled in the designer in a feature we call N-tier datasets. So now you can specify in the dataset designer the place where the data access code should be generated and where the dataset structure and validation code should be put. This physically separates these classes and allows you to share only the dataset and validation code on your client, leaving the data access in the table adapters on the server. In order to demonstrate this, we're going to build a very simple N-tier application using a WCF service and the N-tier datasets against the NGUველN database. So first I've got Visual Studio 2008 open, and we're going to create a new project, Windows Forms application. This will be the client, and we'll name it NGUველN client. So the next thing we need to do is we're going to add a data access layer. So I'm just going to go to File, Add, New Project, and it says that we need to save this one, so we'll go ahead and save this one. And I'm just going to save this solution. We're going to call it NGUველN N-tier. Okay, and then I'm going to now create a class library. And so this class library we'll call NGUველN Data Access Layer. Okay, so now we're going to add a new data source into this class library. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to my NGUველN database, which I already have in my Server Explorer. And I'm going to go ahead and select the orders table. So just to demonstrate a simple example here, we'll select orders, and I'll name it orders dataset. And this will create a dataset for us. And if we take a look, double click on orders dataset, we'll now see that there is this new property called Dataset Project. So now what we want to do is we want to create a separate project in order to put the entity, meaning the structure of the dataset here, and the validation code, but leave the table adapter, the orders table adapter, here inside of the data access layer. So I'm going to create a third class library here, or third project, and another class library. So just File, Add, New Project. I've already got class library selected, and we'll call this NGUველN Entities. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this class 1 because we're not going to need it. So now we're back here in our dataset designer, and now we can go ahead and select for our dataset project NGUველN Entities. Now when we hit save, you'll see that in the NGUველN Entities project, the dataset designer code is generated here. Even though we design it from the data access layer, the structure is being placed inside NGUველN Entities. And now when we go ahead and add some code, I'm just going to double click on the orders. In the partial class code, you can now see that the orders dataset.db file is located in the entity. So this is where our validation code would be. So this allows us to share the structure and the validation code on our client and our server without having to expose any of the details of the database. So I've prepared a piece of validation code for this dataset that I've already placed into my toolbox, just created a code snippet. And I'm just going to put that here. And all it does is it just checks to make sure that the order date is before the ship date. Okay? So that's just some simple logic. So let's go ahead and press save there. Okay, so now I'm going to close that and close that out. And now I'm going to add or modify configure the query here, okay? Because I don't want to bring down all the orders. I just want to bring down all the orders where customer ID we specify. Okay, parameter. All right, so and I'm going to just name this fill by customer ID. We want this to be a bit more scalable. You never want to return all the records from your database. Actually, custom get data by. Okay, there we go. Now we can press save and close. So now what I want to do is I want to create just a NGUველN data manager class so that it's easier to access our data. So I'm just going to go ahead and right-click on Class 1 and rename this and call NGUველN Data Manager. Okay, so we're going to have two methods, one to retrieve the orders and one to save them. So let's go ahead and start writing some code. So public function get orders, and we need the customer ID, so ival customer. In NGUველN, this is a string. As NGUველN entities, that's where our order data set is. Okay, and then we're just going to have another function here. Oops, public function save orders. And we're going to pass here by ref the orders. Set. And we're going to return just a boolean if it's saved or not saved. Okay, so let's go ahead and write the implementation in here. So first we're going to just need to get at the table adapter. That's in the NGUველN data access layer, adapters, there we go. And then we're going to say dim orders as new order data set and ta dot fill by customer ID the orders table and pass it that customer ID, and then we can just go ahead and return orders. Okay, and then the save orders. Okay, we'll just create dim saved. Okay, and we'll return that. Okay, and then in here, you're going to check to make sure that if the orders has changes, because you don't want to bother if it doesn't have any changes, and also orders, let's see, not has errors. Excuse me, does not have errors. I just want to make sure that it's valid. There we go. Then. Now we're going to use the table adapter manager. This is a new object in Visual Studio 2008. I did a video on this. That is also in the NGUველN data access layer table adapter manager. And now we just say manager dot orders table adapter equals new. Back up the data set before update. can say save equals manager dot update all orders greater than 0. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now we have just a NGUWEN Data Manager, and now we can call this NGUWEN Data Manager from a WCF service. So now we just need to create the service. Okay, so I'm just going to go to File, Add, New Website, and select WCF Service, and I'm just going to leave the default WCF Service 1. You can name it whatever you want. Okay, so this creates a couple files for us, and it creates the iService, which is basically just the interface. The contract describes the functions we're going to need to implement in the service. So what I'm going to do first, though, is add a reference to our data access layer and our entities project, because we're going to be working with the database and also with our entities. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and import, to make it easier, NGUWEN entities. Okay, so now what the functions I want are get orders. Okay, so yval customer ID as string, it's a string in NGUWEN, as orders data set. Okay, and then we're also going to do a save orders. And this one's going to be, because we're going to modify the contents of that data set, by ref orders as orders data set as Boolean, okay? Which will just tell us if it's saved or not. Okay, so we can add more operations here. The ones you want to expose as a WCF service need to have the attribute operation contract. So we're not going to use data contracts here. This is if we were going to define our own types. We're just going to go ahead and stick with the operation contracts. And now we go ahead and into our service here. You'll see that it's got some errors now. We can just delete these implementations and go ahead and now get our own. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to import the data access layer, and we're going to call our manager now, our NGUWEN Data Manager that we wrote, right? So dim as new NGUWEN Data Manager, okay, and we're just going to say return manager dot get orders customer ID. Okay, and then here, same idea, except now we're going to save. So dim, well, here, we'll just do this. Okay. All right, so now we've got our WCF service ready to go. So I'm just going to go ahead and rebuild my solution here. Okay, so it succeeded. So now what we're going to do is we are going to now add a couple references to our client project. We're going to need to add a reference to our NGUWEN entities. So I'm just going to right click and add a reference. And we're going to share, this is what we're sharing, the structure and the validation logic. Hit OK. And so now we're going to need to add the WCF service reference. So right click and add service reference. And this will open up the add service reference dialog. We can go ahead and click discover, and it will discover all of the services that are inside of our solution. So when we go ahead and expand this, it will start the service and will allow us to pick the methods. So here we go. So here's the service. Excuse me, not the methods, the service itself. So here's the contract, get orders and save orders. Okay, so this is the one we want, and I'm just going to call it NGUWEN service. Okay, this is just the name the client has. The other thing I should mention is there's also this advanced button. We could go in here and take a look at what it is. I'm not going to change anything, but one of the things you'll notice by default is it says reuse types in referenced assemblies. What that means is that because we added a reference to the NGUWEN entities, it's going to be able to reuse those types on the client. So it's not going to regenerate a bunch of types again that match what the types are on our server. So, so this is really cool because in this particular N-tier scenario, when you have a small distributed application where you're talking .NET to .NET and you want to pass data sets around and reuse your validation logic, this is a great strategy. So, okay, so by default that already happens. So we click OK. Okay, so that generates that service reference. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our form. And I'm going to go ahead and expand the data sources, and you'll see because we have NGUವೆN entities, we'll see the data set here. And I'm just going to drag the orders onto this form. And we're going to go ahead and I'll just dock it in parent container. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so now we have to add code that will load and save these orders. Okay, so the first bit of code I'm just going to add to the form's load, so just double click and I'm just going to then say dim proxy as new, what do we call it, NGUವೆN, NGUweN service dot service client. Okay, and all we're going to do is just say me.orders dataset dot merge the proxy dot get orders, what is it, get, there it is, get orders. And I'm just going to hard code the customer ID for now. We could have a drop down or whatever, but let's just do it this way for the simple example. Okay, so before we do implement the save, let's just see and make sure this works. So I'm going to hit F5. And you'll see that here are all of our orders for the customer Alfke. So now you also see that it says unable to automatically debug this service, and this is just letting us know that we haven't actually enabled debugging on our WCF service, but we can see that our form did pull up. So let's go ahead and enable debugging because it does help us debug our service. Just by default it doesn't turn it on because you never want to have debugging on in a production environment. So let's go back up into our web config on our service, and in order to enable some of this debugging that we're going to want, we're going to need to do two things. We're going to need to do debug here true, and also we're going to want to, for now, while we're debugging our service, it's sometimes a good idea to go ahead and enable the include exception default detail in false. So if there's an exception thrown in your service, it can throw that exception all the way down to the client so you can tell what's happening. So I'm going to go ahead and set both of those things to true. Press save. Go back to our client. We're just going to set this as the startup project and then go ahead and hit F5 again. And now you'll see our form comes up without any complaint, and we'll also be able to set breakpoints into our WCF service. Okay, so now we've got our client form coming up, and so let's test out some of this validation logic, right? So we want to make sure that the ship date is after the order date. So I can go ahead and say, maybe let's make this 4/1/2008. And now you'll see that you have your validation firing here on the client. Remember, because we are sharing this NGUweN entities project, which has our orders, data set validation, and structure. Okay, so that's how easy it is. It did not go back to the server to get this. So now let's just, final thing is to handle our save. So I'm going to go back to the form, and let's write some save code. So to do that, I'll just jump over here and I'll right click on the save button. We'll enable it, and I'll double click. And so I'm just going to get this out of the way. It'll be easier to see. So what we're going to do is we're just going to say me.validate, validate the form, and then me.orders binding source .end edit, and this will flush any changes we have in the grid to the data source, to that data set. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to dim up our client side service reference here, and then I'm going to get the changes. Okay, and the changes are going to be we're going to cast the me.orders dataset.getChanges to the ΔOIN entities.orders dataset. Okay, so that'll just give us a type, because getChanges just returns a data set, and we want the data set to be typed as an orders data set. So, and then I'm just going to say if, make sure that we actually got something back here, is not nothing. Okay, then if the proxy.saveOrders, okay, and changes, then, so now that means we actually saved, right? So MSG box saved. Oops, excuse me, I'm just going to say that we saved, else not saved. Okay, the only thing that is different here is that because we're sending our data set across tiers, is when we add new rows to our data set here on the client, they are indicated by negative numbers. Okay, so negative numbers in the primary key field. So that's what's going to happen. So as we add new rows, you'll see -1, -2, -3. So when we send all that data to the middle tier, it's going to go ahead and save it just fine, but what we're going to need to do is merge those changes from the middle tier back into our client. And because the database assigns primary keys, we're not going to be able to match the merge on the keys anymore, because we're going to have negative numbers and we're going to have the real keys coming from the database. So we know, though, if we save the orders, we know for sure that those added rows got added because everything's saved properly, return true. So all we need to do is remove those added rows from this client-side data set and then merge those changes from the middle tier back in. Okay, so it sounds a lot harder than it is. So let's just write a link query here real quick to remove those rows. Okay, excuse me, added rows. Okay, equals from row in me.orders dataset.orders. And what you just want where the row state is equal to added. Okay, so that will return just a collection of rows. Okay, so we're going to say for each row in added rows, row dot delete. And actually, I'm going to say added rows dot to array. Okay, that way it gives us a new reference and we can actually delete these rows. Okay, so then after that's good, we just say me.orders dataset dot merge dot changes, and after that's all good, we just say me.orders dataset dot accept changes. Okay, so now the orders dataset is all hunky-dory and it's all saved in the middle tier. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit F5 again, and we'll test out our save and make sure everything works. Okay, so let's go ahead and make it a little bit bigger here. And so I'm going to remove a couple rows, and we'll change this to 2007, and I'll add a new row. So here's the counting right here. FKI 3 1 2 2007. Okay, that's good enough information. And what we can do real quick is I have SQL Server Profiler running, and so what we could do is we can take a look and make sure that the database is actually getting updated in the proper order. So when we go ahead and press save, and we see this little saved, it actually saved through our middle tier, and we can take a look at that. We have a transaction, we have an insert, we have our update, and we have our delete, and then a commit transaction. Okay, so that's how you work with N-tier datasets in Visual Studio 2008. So I'd like to thank you for your time. If you'd like to check out the Visual Basic Developer Center, we'll be posting updates to these videos there. Please also check out the Visual Basic team blog and my blog for more information. Thanks again.